said earlier that humans aren't greedy, selfish, aggressive, sadistic and controlling. These are attributes alien to us and can only be brought out through specific mind control campaigns. This then begs the question, who are the controllers? I recently listened to a podcast where a man had been brought up in a satanic cult family environment, and this idea of Satanism needs to be examined, but his explanation of why ordinary people are inducted into this cult lifestyle was interesting. He said rather than be the prisoners of this society, they'd prefer to be the jailers. The controllers seem to have an intricate indoctrination program, where the dark aspects of human nature that normally reside in the hidden recesses of our mind are coaxed out, and the weaker, less moralistic of our number will succumb more easily than others. The overall agenda would appear to be to make us more like them, and keep our minds occupied with fear and distractions so that we haven't the capacity to manifest our true nature of love, compassion and peaceful coexistence. We are programmed and even mocked by these controllers, in their sick and twisted moral code, where images and symbols are placed everywhere. Our culture is riddled with symbolism that few people recognize, largely due to the concept of abstraction. Particularly in the post-war period, a culture of extreme relaxation of standards within art meant that imagery and symbols were accepted as simply being an expression of abstract thought, and forgiven in that way. This serves to allow disturbing and improper messaging to be placed all around us, such as Eric Gill's paedophilic statue adorning the BBC building in London, with the excuse that it's just an abstract concept, and we simply have to deal with it in an offhand fashion. Before summarizing what I feel might explain the truth behind these various episodes, I'll introduce another facet. We are told that in what we understand as the late 18th through to the 19th century, the world was riddled with conflict. We had the Napoleonic Wars and the American War of Independence, followed by their Civil War. During this period we had a multitude of national conflicts throughout Europe as well as the Boer War, all of which coincided with the curious rise of prisons, mental institutions and orphanages across the world. We also have mass migrations of the world's populations to places like Australia and America. A curious anomaly, yet another in this story, are where photographs of destruction of cities during the American Civil War show destruction claimed to be mostly by fire, but anyone who looks at them sees, not only mass bombing style destruction, but also how easily combustible things like trees seem to stand untouched among the ruins. I'd urge those new to this area of study to follow my lunch break on YouTube, as an easy-to-watch series of short essays on this phenomenon with particular focus on the architecture. What is the true narrative behind these conflicts and forced migrations? There seems to me to have been a worldwide interruption in our cultural development, maybe a little over 200 years ago, and for a few reasons we could take 1776 as a rough starting point. The structure of societies collapsed due to a mass destruction event, maybe natural, that was seized upon by an opportunistic cult. In order to control those who survived, the populations were divided and deported across the world to establish populations in unfamiliar cities, and introduce a strict regime of indoctrination, erasing the truth of our past and imposing obedience to lies that would support the natural accession of this new order. Conflicts would be instigated worldwide in order to thin out populations and divide them, and those unwilling to comply would end up in their confinement institutions. Mostly this would be women into insane asylums, men into prisons and their children placed into orphanages. In health, as with mostly everything else we are told, the opposite is true. It occurred to me a couple of years ago that, bearing this in mind, why was smoking suddenly demonized? Throughout the latter part of the 20th century, cigarettes were promoted, characterized as being cool and sophisticated. Edward Bernays, a regular asset of this deception culture, was enlisted to encourage women to take it up after being frowned upon up until then. Yet for the last couple of decades we've seen prices rocket, horrifying images emblazoned onto packaging, and campaigns urging us to quit. It occurs to me that when cigarettes were first promoted it allowed these little rats to put poisons in with the tobacco, and nicotine, far from being addictive, is actually beneficial to us, with nicotine receptors spread around our bodies. But addictive supplements were added, mainly to the paper, to get us hooked. It seems that nicotine has an efficacious effect in tackling the microtechnology that this cult has planned to introduce over these last few years, and discouraging us from smoking is actually to prevent our bodies fighting back against it. In 2020 a group of us did experiments with the blue face masks after seeing videos online, and sure enough we filmed tiny nanotech worms emerging from the fibers, responding to the warmth and moisture of a cup of water, simulating the breath of those gullible enough to wear them. We subsequently discovered that these disgusting things were in everything from breakfast cereals to women's products and even nappies. We're dealing with truly inhuman monsters. The concept of countries has reinforced a feeling of distancing ourselves from people around us in other lands, instigating a hostile mistrust under the illusion that different areas of the world have evolved according to a personally preferred way of life, seeing other countries as potentially threatening. The concept of money has allowed a usury system to ensure that only those utilizing their most basic instincts of greed, obedience and ego would be successful, combined with religions tailored to target particular cultural groups and create division. Institutions were covertly founded to ensure that all aspects of health, information and governance were manned with gatekeepers, masquerading as organically evolved institutions. Those among us succumbing to their weakest instincts with a facility for eloquence and memory would be inducted into manning these posts, thereby facilitating the gradual poisoning of our crops, water and food under the guise of being beneficial supplements. I'll just preface with an explanation of a term I'll be using that I referenced earlier. Many people have unearthed references to a land called Tartary or Tartaria on ancient maps that isn't mentioned at all in the official record, other than being a vague generic cultural area of little importance in Central Asia. This Tartarian reference appears on many obscure maps, and many researchers have inferred that there was a worldwide, dominant Tartarian empire to which they attribute these structures that we see masquerading as libraries, state capitol buildings etc. Whether this is the case or not, it serves as a useful term to describe these structures that are claimed to have been built mostly in the 19th century, with some European examples claimed as being much older. The timeline interruption has been a major difficulty for them in hiding the truth, and in the early days those structures that would most visibly give away their deception would have been destroyed as a priority. But with thousands of these structures across the world in every town and city, it would have been a side project to complete once they'd gained sufficient control of worldwide societies. We can only guess at what evidential truths have been destroyed already, probably to do with cultural lineages, energy production and health. There's a popular belief that our world undergoes regular natural disasters, even predicting exact cycles. Jason Brescia's Archaics is an interesting resource with his research on what he refers to as the Phoenix cycles, where worldwide catastrophes happen regularly throughout history, and those with privileged information have an advantage over the rest of us. I feel that the so-called ancient landmarks like the pyramids in Egypt, South America and the Far East have an even more disconnected feel to them than the Tartarian culture, and they invoke in me a sense of an abandoned studio lot, where different stages have been set up and left to decay independently. We all have a natural desire to see history as a linear path, where one episode is a consequence of the previous one, but is this true? We could devise various titles to label particular assumed passages of time. For instance, we could use terms like the Roman era or the Aztec era, and I'd describe the last 2 centuries or so as the plastic era. My own opinion of our current plastic era may differ from most if not all people, where my belief is that this era is the first to undergo a slavery system reset. My feelings on this are based on the fact, as I say, that all of these previous eras have evidence of unbelievable technology in their architecture. Whether it's an Aztec temple, Egyptian pyramid or Tartarian structure, it shows they obviously had this architecture as an intrinsic part of their culture, with the technological details readily available to the masses, yet our era alone has none of it. I see a possible explanation as being that the world experiences major disasters throughout history, and the survivors of previous civilizations have had to pick themselves up and dust themselves off, eventually resuming the cultural technology similar to one destroyed. With the demise of the last culture before ours, however, a devious cult was prepared and took advantage for themselves. As a consequence, all we have are the degradable temporary structures designed to keep us enslaved. I see the plastic era in which we live as analogous to Satan's little season as mentioned in the Bible, and as such gives us a unique place in history. Even though we are not told how long this little season is, we can hope it ends soon. If this reset took place around 1800, then all of these Tartarian structures were already there at that time, when worldwide populations were introduced into these towns and cities. The official narrative we've been given, however, is that almost all of these buildings were constructed in the 19th century. Now, if they kept to a narrative that this structural technology simply halted in 1800, it would cause 2 problems. Firstly, it would leave a huge smoking gun, where this demarcation line stood out like a sore thumb, and secondly, there would be a huge anomaly as to how a horse and cart culture could erect these magnificent palaces. A solution could be to introduce photography into our culture, graphically illustrating these cowboys on horseback next to construction images of these palaces. One problem they'd face, however, is that a city's inhabitants who had a grand structure that had been there throughout their occupation would now be told that it was actually built during their lifetime. This is where the narrative of several rebuilds taking place on the same footprint comes into play. Here's how it might work. Let's imagine the city of Somewhereville, with a large Tartarian building used as a courthouse in the center of the city in 1800. If they said that it was built in 1830, there would obviously be many inhabitants alive who'd lived there since 1800 who would challenge it. Bear in mind also, though, that the primitive information technology would mean that this information was stored in carefully monitored libraries, newspapers, universities, etc., so it would only be threatened by those specifically seeking it out, and who would subsequently challenge it and not be able to be silenced. A better approach, though, would be to wait until around 1840 and covertly manufacture a narrative that it was originally a more primitive building which was demolished in 1830 to make way for an updated construction. This way any protestations could be more easily controlled, where any challenges could be claimed to be misconceptions, while not denying the fact that there was a courthouse on the site. It wasn't this one, and look, we've a construction image to prove it. The same trick could be used multiple times with the same building over the course of the century. This way the gradual rewriting of the narrative achieves the goal of having this structure built anytime they want, keeping the population in the dark, or at least creating a more credible challenge.